Does buying and using fancy building materials matter? Short answer, yes. Long answer, it depends. So if that's all you really wanted, there's the answer. But if you want me to explain my thoughts on it, stick around. It's no secret that I like to buy and test out new different types of building supplies. I have been infatuated with a bunch of AK's texture pastes for a while now, and I kind of went on a little spending spree, ripped my wallet. And just to be upfront, this isn't an ad. I've never been paid a dime. I've bought all of these with my own money, and these are just genuinely my own opinions. But I definitely did want to see if I was getting my money's worth. So I wanted to create 3 separate bases that were all the same simple little scheme, just using wildly different price point materials to see if I can get a similar result. So having said that, I went about creating some bases. For the simple bases, I'm just going to go with some concrete next to some sand. Very inspired, I know. For the first one, I just carved out some slabs with a pencil and gave it a little bit of texture using a tinfoil ball. For the sand texture, I created my own little paste using some PVA glue, some dirt from my backyard, and a little bit of cheap acrylic paint. I saved the stencil that I used for my hanger diorama last year and used that as the base for creating some little stencil work on the ground. I just made a creamier white, off-white color and stippled it on using a sponge. I wanted to go for that weathered look, so I figured this was the cheapest and easiest way to do it. Wanting to blend in the concrete with the sand, I used a dustier sandy kind of color. I think it was the same one actually I used for the sand itself. Using a brush, I then painted on a lighter color just to help give again some more of that texture. Follow this up using a darker wash for some of the recesses and thinning it down even further as a glaze almost to glaze over certain spots here and there. And now we're coming up to one of the more tricky points. I wanted to use some static grass tufts, but again, trying to be as cheap as possible, I used a paintbrush that I had let soak in some brown paint just to help give it that kind of color that I was looking for, and let it dry. Once it was dry, I then cut off little tufts and glued them to the surface. While this technique might work when mixing it with static grass, I don't think it stands up on its own very well. This is the kind of first place that I would start looking into spending a little bit of extra money or saving up for in the future. Once the tufts were dry, I then went over the concrete with some more of a burnt umber wash just to kind of show that stuff was parked there and just, again, more wear and tear. For a piece of background terrain, I think this works just fine, but the next few builds I think have some vast improvements, so we'll move on to those. On to the middle price point. So the way I wanted to improve upon this next piece was that I was going to use my concrete slabs. These are the same concrete slabs that I've used many times. In fact, that same hanger video before, I used them all over the place, so if you want to see some more of those, go check that video out. But if this is the first time you've seen this, all I use is some plaster of Paris, sand, some tulle fabric, and a simple little jig made out of styrene. You don't actually need to use the tulle fabric, but it really does help it keep it together if you start shaping it more and breaking it in pieces. One of my favorite features of this actually is how accepting it is to cracking and keeping those cracks together. So once it was dry, I then scribed all of the slabs into the same shape as I did the first piece and cracked it here and there, using a toothbrush to help expand the cracks here and there, just to give them a little bit more wideness. This plaster is so receptive to cracking, chipping, breaking, and just naturally deforming in a really realistic manner, which I think we can really use to our advantage. For that sandy base, I wanted to bring back a staple of mine, which is my homemade Sculptamold. Again, I've used this stuff almost on all my builds, but again, it is just blended spray attic insulation. The last bag of this I bought was in 2021, and I'm still on the same bag, which is why I consider it the mid price point, because I still have plenty of it left. And then to unify the color, I just used a cheap rattle can spray primer. For the concrete color, I just used Tamiya's deck tan and sprayed it in a modeling pattern, allowing some of the opacity to vary here and there to help give some more of that texture. Now, if you consider using a airbrush to be not in the middle price point, you can do all of this using a brush. If you think using an airbrush puts it into the high-end things, maybe you're right, but I definitely think that getting an airbrush should be on the higher list of priorities than some of these texture pastes. Following up this, I used a darker gray wash, a earthier or sandy mid-tone to help blend with the sandy color, and then at the end going over with a deck tan, this time from AK, just to give more texture and highlights here and there. I wanted to make the cracks in the concrete pop a little bit more, so I used a ink wash to help bring out those recesses where shadows would naturally kind of occur. I then brushed on a sandy color, like Iraqi sand from Vallejo. Once this was dry, I then moved on to prepping for the stencil. I didn't want to use the same sponge chipping method, so for this I used the hairspray chipping method. And as the name implies, no fancy chipping fluid needed, just a can of hairspray. So I sprayed that thoroughly over the surface, and once it was dry, I painted it using a creamier off-white color again. Once the paint was dry, it was then on to reactivating the chipping fluid, or the hairspray, using some water and a stiff brush. Luckily, there's no real right or wrong way of doing this. It is just scraping away and trying to get something that looks kind of natural. I then used some static grass tufts that I had made for my desert diorama. Tufts are actually really easy to make yourself if you buy all of the static grass in bulk, but certainly less convenient. Once again, I wanted to dirty up and weather the surface a little bit more, so I used some track wash enamel paints from AK and stippled and splattered them on using a toothpick. For blending and smoothing out some of the transitions, I just used some simple mineral spirits that I got from a general home store. And that about does it for the mid tier. And now we're on to the high tier. For this, I just used a thin sheet of cork to be used as the basis for the concrete texture paste that I wanted to use. I wanted to use the cork instead of just applying it directly to the XPS foam, so it would give it a little bit of height and allow me to dig into the surface a little bit further just to help give more depth to those cracks. For the sandy side, I just used AK's beach sandy texture. And then I scribed into the same lines into the concrete as I have for the other two pieces. And this is where I decided, just because that cork is showing through, I'm going to end up painting all of this anyways, thus kind of negating the real big advantage these texture pastes have in that, one, they have a consistent color, and two, they just come right out of the box that way, and you're paying for the convenience of it. So I'm kind of negating all of that by doing that. But hey, that means I get to use my Mr. Surfacer's 1500 black primer, so we're going to do that. And then I painted it the exact same way I painted the last piece. The only thing that was really different was the fact that the texture paste and the cork underneath of it was actually pretty absorbent, and it felt like it was behaving just that slightly bit different than it was with the plaster concrete pieces. I was actually super happy with the way the fake shadows around the edges came out. It felt like it had a really good contrast that I was pretty happy with. And ultimately, I didn't even need to use that black wash that I had with the second step, just because, again, I felt the shadows were pretty good with the first pass. And then it was on to prepping for the stencil work. For this, I actually used chipping fluid instead of the hairspray method. And here I sprayed 1 to 2 really thick coats. Once it was dry, I used that same creamy off-white color to stencil on that number 3. I then went about using some wet brushes to help pull away some of that paint. Here's where I think that permeability or that absorption of the previous layers really kind of was a downfall for the chipping fluid, as I think it went through it and not really stayed on the surface. Either way, I wasn't getting the kind of chipping that I was looking for, long story short. I then applied the same tufts and moved on to weathering the concrete itself again. But for this time, I wanted to use some Abteilung's oils, so I prepared them and applied them the same way I applied those enamel oils, and used again to blend in and dilute some of those bigger splotches. And with that thereabout does it. So thank you for humoring me about doing this side by side. I know it's not a big project, but I definitely think there's a lot of interesting things here. I know, like myself, I'm sure some of you have had a lot of questions about, are these products worth your money? Because money is not an easy thing to come by these days, especially when groceries are so expensive. So if you were on the fence about some of these, hopefully this was informative. But to answer my question at the beginning of the video, yes, some of these things do make sense to buy, like static grass, some of the paints. There's definitely a step up when you go from the apple barrel cheap paints to the nicer Vallejo or 3rd gen AK paints. But there's other things that just don't make too much sense unless you have a very specific need for them. These texture pastes are really cool, but as you saw from me, I ended up painting over most of them anyways. So unless you're batch building something, i.e. you're making bases for miniatures, it might make sense to buy these pastes. But you can also make cheap texture pastes yourself with like dirt from your backyard. So the only thing that I think they really give you is convenience and time, which, hey, that's, if you have a full-time job and you only have 10 minutes a day to craft, it might be worth all its weight in gold. So ultimately, I believe the middle tier is the most cost effective and the most effective, at least for me. I'll try to wrap it up as this is getting a bit too rambly. What are your guys' thoughts? What compromises do you think are the best? Which techniques can you go without? Which one was your favorite? I don't know. Let me know. If you want to see more of these comparisons in the future, again, I can do some more. I've got plenty of more things that I didn't even get to use this time. So yeah, let me know. Thank you guys so much for making it this far. You guys are absolutely insane if you're still here. You guys are truly awesome. I'm gonna wrap it up here. If you like what you saw and you want to see some more, click here. And if not, I'll catch you guys in the next one.